At a time when the war was claiming millions more lives and factories in the Reich were working day and night, someone in Berlin came up with an idea so absurd that today it is hard to believe it was taken seriously. In times when steel, fuel and spare parts were in short supply, it was decided to build something that was meant to be indestructible. Thus was born the project of a tank that was slower than a snail, more fuel-hungry than a squadron of aircraft, and more expensive than an entire armoured division. It was called the Panzerkampfwagen C8D Maus, and never in military history has this word sounded so ironic. For German engineers, it was supposed to be the crown of technical genius. In practice, it became a grotesque symbol of military madness. In 1942, when soldiers on the Eastern Front were fighting for every barrel of fuel, an order appeared in the design offices of the Porsche concern to develop a super-heavy tank. Adolf Hitler, convinced that bigger means better, demanded a vehicle whose armour could not be pierced by any cannon in the world. Engineers warned that this was impossible. Bridges in Europe would not support a machine weighing over 170 tons, and the logistics of the entire army would collapse trying to transport it. But an order is an order. In Germany, no one dared to say no. Thus began one of the most absurd stories in the annals of military history. The first sketches of the Maus were created in March 1942. It was assumed that the vehicle would have armour 200mm thick and a cannon of 128mm calibre, supported by a 75mm gun. It sounded impressive until someone calculated that the chassis alone weighed as much as 2 locomotives. Moreover, in a country that barely maintained supply lines for Panthers and Tigers, building such a colossus was logistical suicide. Dr. Ferdinand Porsche, a man whose name is today associated with elegant sports cars, was then one of the leader's closest technical advisors. He believed he could create something that would ensure German superiority over the Soviet Union. But his vision turned into an obsession. The team of engineers warned the vehicle would not be able to cross even an ordinary bridge. Porsche's answer was short. That is not a problem. We will build new bridges. Soon another absurdity appeared. It turned out that no engine in the Reich was capable of powering a monster weighing over 180 tons. So they tried to create a hybrid unit. A gasoline engine was to power a generator, and that in turn would power electric motors at the wheels. In theory, it sounded like a miracle of technology. In practice, like a recipe for disaster. As soon as the prototype was started, it overheated after a few minutes. It happened that the entire team had to flee because the engine started to catch fire. Despite this, the project continued. No one had the courage to stop it. In 1943, when the Eastern Front was already wavering and German cities were burning after air raids, factories in Essen and Stuttgart continued to produce parts for a tank that could not even drive off a ramp on its own. Besides, to transport it from one place to another, it was necessary to separate the turret from the hull and transport them separately on 2 gigantic railway wagons. At a time when thousands of soldiers were fighting in the mud, Porsche presented a model of the new tank before a military commission. Silence fell in the room. Officers who knew what real war looked like looked at the construction with disbelief. One of them reportedly said under his breath, "This is not a tank, it is a bunker on tracks." And indeed, the Maus was not a tank in the classical sense. It was rather a mobile fortress that needed a separate platoon of mechanics just to move. The first prototype was completed at the end of 1943. Tests took place in the cold and mud of Kummersdorf. When the vehicle moved, the ground beneath it trembled as if in an earthquake. Every metre cost litres of fuel, and every stop ended in a breakdown. After a few hours of trials, the engine stalled. Mechanics had to use 2 tractors to tow it away. Some engineers began to joke that if the Maus drove onto a bridge, it would collapse faster than the morale of the Wehrmacht at Kursk. But documents still wrote about the strategic importance of the project. Notes by Speer have been preserved in the archives, warning that it was impossible to fight in Europe with such a machine. However, no one wanted to be the one who dared to oppose an idea from the very top. On paper, the Maus was supposed to be a wonder weapon that would break through any line of defence. In reality, it could not drive even a few kilometres without a breakdown. Its top speed, 13 kilometres per hour, was a joke compared to the Soviet T-34s, which sped along at over 40. In one of the test reports, it was recorded that the vehicle consumed 700 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres. That is more than an entire company of Panthers needed. The absurdity went further. To refuel a single tank, it was necessary to empty several railway tanker cars. If it had ever made it to the front, its fuel column would have dragged on longer than the front itself. Commanders began to joke that the Maus could defeat the enemy only if they died of laughter, seeing the Germans trying to pull their own tank onto a platform. And yet, at that time, no one stopped believing in the myth of the wonder weapon. Propaganda needed a symbol of power, even if that symbol was a parody of common sense. The Maus was supposed to be proof that German technology was capable of overcoming any obstacle. Only the obstacle turned out to be reality. In 1944, Allied bombers destroyed the Krupp plants where the armour for the Maus was being assembled. Production stopped. Officially, the project was suspended, but Dr. Porsche still tried to convince the authorities that his machine had a future. He still believed he had created something great, and he was right, only in the worst sense of the word. At the end of the war, 2 unfinished examples remained. One of them was only partially functional, the other had no turret. They were supposed to be proud mobile fortresses, and they became steel monuments to absurdity. Their fate was to be decided in the final months of the war when the Red Army reached Kummersdorf. When Soviet troops approached Kummersdorf, chaos reigned among the German officers. On the grounds of the proving ground stood 2 colossuses, tanks that were supposed to change the fate of the war, but in reality failed to even set off for the front. The first of them was fully assembled, but without a fully functional engine. The second, with a hull devoid of a turret, looked like an unfinished monument to engineering megalomania. Thus ended the dream of the wonder weapon that was supposed to save the collapsing Reich. Ferdinand Porsche could not come to terms with defeat. Although Minister Albert Speer had already issued an order in July 1944 to stop all heavy tank projects, the constructor stood his ground. In his notes from the beginning of 1945, desperation is visible. The Maus has potential. If we manage to improve it, nothing will stand in the way of our technical superiority. In these words, however, echoed not genius, but a loss of contact with reality. While the Reich's fronts were shrinking with every week, Porsche insisted on continuing tests. The tank, which could not exceed 13 km per hour, was now being shifted from place to place around the research centre grounds. Every movement required dozens of soldiers, tractors, and barrels of fuel. It was recorded in reports that during one of the tests, over 2,000 litres of gasoline were consumed to move the vehicle less than 3 kilometres. For the technicians, it was torture. The interior of the tank heated up to over 50 degrees, the noise exceeded all norms, and smoke from the electric combustion engine filled the entire chamber. Often, tests were interrupted due to power system failures. It happened that to start the Colossus, 2 trucks with generators were needed to supply current before the engine could manage to spin up on its own. Despite these failures, the project was officially never completely cancelled. A report from March 1944 has been preserved in the archives, in which Porsche tried to convince Hitler to resume production. He claimed that the new version, the so-called Maus 2, would be lighter, faster, and more reliable. In reality, the plan assumed increasing the thickness of the armour and mounting a new gun, which would have raised the machine's mass even further. In practice, this was therefore not an improvement, but a deepening of the problem. Speer noted in his memoirs that the conversation about the Maus was one of the most senseless he conducted during the war. Hitler, who just a year earlier had ordered the end of all super-heavy tank projects, listened attentively, then stated that maybe it is worth finishing 2 examples for testing purposes. That was enough for the factories to start producing elements again for a project that had long since lost any combat significance. At the same time, Allied bombs were falling on Essen, Dortmund and Kassel. The Krupp plants, responsible for the armour, were seriously damaged. Every new casting required weeks of work and tons of coal, which was already in short supply. Steel was needed to repair locomotives, trucks and bridges, but in the bureaucratic labyrinth of the war economy, no one dared to challenge a decision from above. When in January 1945 the Red Army crossed the Oder, tests of electric control systems were still ongoing in Kummersdorf. It was there, in the last days of March, that technicians discovered that the power cables for the motors had burned out. The repair took 3 weeks. When they finished, the first Soviet units appeared on the horizon. The order was simple: destroy everything that could fall into enemy hands. However, the Maus was so heavy that it was impossible to blow it up in its entirety. They tried to set fire to the interior, but the steel colossus only scorched slightly inside. One of the soldiers recalled after the war that the tank looked like a steel corpse that does not want to die. When the Soviets reached Kummersdorf, they saw something that resembled a laboratory more than a battlefield. 2 mighty hulls, tons of documentation, and dozens of abandoned tools. One of the prototypes had been partially destroyed during the retreat, the other was taken over in almost intact condition. Soviet engineers were fascinated. At first they did not believe that a machine of such weight moved at all. A special commission was sent from Kubinka to assess the possibility of transport to the Soviet Union. The task was so difficult that it required the reconstruction of railway tracks and the reinforcement of wagons. After several weeks of logistical operations in May 1945, the Maus set off on its only journey in history, not to the front but to the enemy's museum. The Soviets assembled the turret from the second example and placed it on the preserved hull. Thus was created the only complete Maus that has survived to this day, not as a weapon but as proof of how far military obsession can go. Soviet technicians, examining the vehicle in Kubinka, noted a whole list of absurdities. The drive system was unstable, the cooling system too weak, the transmissions too delicate for such an enormous mass. To change gear required several seconds and a complete stop. In the final report it was written, "Tank impossible to use in real combat conditions, exceeds all permissible limits of mass and fuel consumption." A joke circulated among officers that the Maus did not need enemy artillery. Its own weight was enough to immobilize it. It was precisely there in Kubinka that the legend of the most useless tank in history was born. The Soviets, although they treated the technical precision of execution with respect, could not help laughing. The machine that was supposed to symbolize the power of German industry became in their eyes a monument to pride. Even German sources after the war admitted that the project was a mistake. Albert Speer wrote in his memoirs that the Maus was an example of total detachment from frontline reality and proof that sometimes engineers fear their superiors more than facts. However, the irony of history lies in the fact that although the Maus never fired a shot in battle, it consumed enormous resources. The steel used for its construction would have been enough for several dozen Panthers. The fuel consumed during tests could have powered an entire transport column for a week. As a result, at a moment when the Wehrmacht desperately needed light, fast vehicles, factories were producing a monster that could not even turn around on a narrow road. For modern observers of the war, it was a symbol of a total loss of proportion. Germany, which at the beginning of the conflict was famous for brilliant tactics and precision, at the end of the war was investing in something that was the negation of its own blitzkrieg philosophy. The Maus could neither attack nor retreat. It was too heavy to cross a river and too slow to avoid an aircraft. Its existence proved that even the best organized war machine can sink under the weight of its own ambitions. When Soviet soldiers climbed onto the armour of the Maus for the first time, one of them reportedly said, "This is not a weapon, it is a monument to their stupidity." And it is hard to find a more apt summary. When reports from Soviet dispatches about the capture of the Maus tank reached the Western world, no one wanted to believe them. Journalists wrote that it was impossible for the Germans to have really built a vehicle weighing over 170 tons. British officers analysing photos from Kubinka stated that it must be a photomontage. No construction of such dimensions could move. But documents that were soon revealed after the war showed something much more absurd than propaganda. It was all true. The Maus really existed, and what is worse, it was the result of an entire military-industrial system in which no one knew how to say, enough. Instead of practical solutions, the army and industry were guided by a vision of technical perfection, detached from the needs of the front. Germany, which once created the dynamic doctrine of blitzkrieg, replaced it in the last years of the war with an obsession with weight and armour. The result was a monster that resembled a mobile bunker more than a weapon of the future. Notes from meetings at the Ministry of Armaments in Berlin have been preserved in the archives. In one of them, a technical officer points out that the production of a single Maus consumed as much copper as 100 frontline radio stations needed. Another official calculated that the cost of building one example exceeded the price of an entire battalion of light tanks. Despite these data, the project still figured in the budget, under the heading Strategic Priority. Most grotesque were the meetings between military men and engineers. The former demanded that the vehicle have full resistance to every known calibre. The latter explained that this meant a weight increase of another dozen or so tons. Discussions always ended the same way. New requirements were added, but no one removed the old ones. As a result, the mouse grew like a steel monster devouring its own creators. Witnesses of these meetings later recalled that in the atmosphere prevailing in the Reich, no one dared to challenge ideas from the highest level. Criticism could mean the loss of a position, and sometimes even something worse. Instead of opposition, therefore, zealous approval appeared. As a result, Porsche's design bureau turned into a place where engineers, instead of looking for solutions, learned to say what was wanted to be heard. Meanwhile, the reality on the front was increasingly dramatic. From 1943, the Wehrmacht struggled with a lack of fuel, and tank production was falling. Factories were turning out ever simpler versions of Panthers and Tigers, stripped of many amenities because components were missing. At the same time, Porsche's design department was ordering high-grade steel and advanced electrical components for a vehicle that had no chance of combat use. In one of the Ministry of Armaments reports from the end of 1943, a note was found. The Maus project is maintained exclusively for propaganda reasons. It has no application in the reality of the battlefield. This sentence, though hidden in secret documents, best describes the logic of late German armament policy. Propaganda needed technical miracles to sustain the morale of society. To this end, it was ready to waste every resource. Attempts at further development of the design were becoming a farce. Photographs have been preserved in the archives showing engineers testing the turret rotation system. To move it, 2 electric motors and power from an external generator were needed. A full rotation of 180 degrees took several dozen seconds. In real combat, this would have meant certain death. Every opponent would have had time to change position 5 times. Firing tests showed another problem. The noise of the shot was so powerful that it caused microcracks in the structure of the turret itself. After several attempts, it was decided that continuing to fire was too risky. The technical report dryly noted inappropriate structural resistance of load-bearing elements. This meant that the tank was unable to withstand its own fire. Military men observing the trials were increasingly embittered. One officer wrote, "If the enemy does not destroy this vehicle, its own mechanics will." It was a bitter comment, but one that fully reflected reality. The Maus, instead of becoming a symbol of technical superiority, became a subject of jokes even among German soldiers. After the war, many engineers tried to justify their decisions. They claimed they had no choice, that they acted under orders. But the facts were implacable. At a time when the army needed mobile, reliable machines, they were producing a useless colossus. As a result, German technical thought, which at the beginning of the war amazed the world, sank into the grotesque. In post-war analyses by Allied commissions, the Maus was classified as an example of inefficient use of war resources. Economists from London and Washington calculated that the production of each new example meant the loss of the possibility to build 5 to 7 medium tanks. Such numbers best showed how useless the whole project was. Also interesting is the fact that the concept of a super-heavy tank was not exclusively a German idea. Earlier, similar ideas had appeared in Great Britain and the Soviet Union, but there they were abandoned after initial tests. Only in Germany was it decided to carry the project through to the end, even though all technical data pointed to its total impracticality. Over time, the Maus began to function as a metaphor, a symbol of German military technological suicide. Even Speer himself, in his memoirs written after the war, admitted that it was an example of how a bureaucratic system can destroy logical thinking. He wrote, "Instead of listening to officers from the front, we listened to our own engineers who were racing with imagination and not with reality." An anecdote circulated in the Reich War Cabinet that if the Maus had actually appeared at the front, it would have needed a separate railway line to get to the battlefield. When someone joked that it could be used to ram the walls of the Kremlin, Speer reportedly replied, "Yes, on the condition that the Kremlin comes to it by itself." This sense of irony, which appeared even then, was the best proof that even in Germany itself, the senselessness of the project was understood, but it was already too late. Hundreds of tons of steel, thousands of man-hours, and enormous amounts of fuel were irretrievably wasted on a construction that never left the proving ground. For historians, the Maus became a warning, a lesson in how far a state can go that believes technology in itself is the answer to all problems. It was not a tank designed for victory, but to show the illusion of power. In this sense, the Maus was not just a machine. It was a manifesto of failure. After the end of the war, the Allies analysed with interest every fragment of documentation seized from German factories. Among hundreds of plans and reports were also those concerning the Mouse project. British and American experts did not hide their astonishment. In reports from 1946, it was written directly: the Germans created a vehicle with parameters unjustified either tactically or strategically. This meant that even the victors recognized the design as senseless. Analyses conducted in the United States showed that the Mouse was in practice a technological dead end. It required infrastructure that no army could provide. Tracks, bridges, and roads would have had to be built anew, and transport itself would have required more investment than an entire armoured division. Against the background of other war machines of that period, the Mouse appeared as a monument to technical arrogance. The most compromising data for German industry were those regarding efficiency. It was calculated that at full load the engine consumed over 700 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres. For comparison, the American Sherman needed barely a quarter of this amount. The difference was so drastic that engineers from Aberdeen Proving Ground described the Mouse as a vehicle that destroys itself through the consumption of its own resources. Many former associates of Porsche tried during interrogations in Nuremberg to blame the pressure of the authorities. They claimed that work on super-heavy tanks was forced. However, documents from Speer's ministry clearly indicated that it was precisely Porsche who insisted on continuing the program, even though the war was already lost. For him, the Mouse was proof of engineering pride. For the rest of the world, it became proof of the total uselessness of German genius in conditions of total war. It is interesting that the Soviet Union, which took over the preserved example, also recognized that the project had no combat value. After a few months of tests in Kubinka, it was decided that further research was a waste of time. The final report contained a short but eloquent sentence: "Tank useless for the Soviet army." For a state that at that time was building thousands of simple, cheap machines, the German Colossus was the antithesis of everything that constituted frontline effectiveness. Over the years, the Mouse became a symbol of everything that went wrong in the German war machine. Military historians emphasize that this program illustrates the collapse of strategic logic and the transition into the sphere of ideological thinking about the wonder weapon. In a world where victory depended on the number of units produced and the efficiency of supply, the Germans were investing in a vehicle they could neither refuel nor transport. For Porsche himself, this episode was a stigma. After the war, his name was associated with luxury cars, but in military circles the memory remained of the constructor who created the heaviest and most useless tank in the world. In private conversations, he reportedly later admitted that it was a mistake forced by time and politics. Although documents left no doubt, the project was continued on his initiative. In post-war Germany, the Mouse remained an embarrassing topic for a long time. It did not fit the image of technical perfection that was being attempted to be rebuilt. Only decades later did historians begin to cite facts showing that this construction consumed resources that could have saved thousands of lives. If instead of a monster weighing 180 tons, 100 simpler vehicles had been built, the army would have gained real support instead of a steel monument to incompetence. Ultimately, the Mouse not only brought no benefit to the Germans, but became a burden on their industry and strategy. Every one of its elements, from the engine to the suspension system, was a warning against uncritical faith in technical miracles. Its story proved that even the most powerful construction has no value if it cannot serve man and the goal for which it was created. In Kubinka, the Mouse stands to this day, silent and heavy as a monument to error. Its armour bears no traces of battles because it never participated in any. Instead of becoming a tool of victory, it remained proof of how far a state can go that chooses the obsession with greatness instead of reason. Visitors look at this machine with disbelief. Gigantic, yet useless. Historians agree that the Mouse was the apogee of German detachment from the realities of war. Born of pride, it consumed resources that ordinary soldiers lacked. It brought no advantage, did not change the course of history, and did not fire a single effective shot. It remained a symbol of technology that forgot about man. If you think the story of the Mouse shows the true face of war absurdity, leave a like, write in the comments what you think about this construction, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss future stories about the most useless war machines.